The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the rest of the world out with a finality that echoed in my chest. I turned the deadbolt, then the security latch, my hand shaking just slightly. 1 week. That was the ultimatum. 7 days to finish the manuscript that was currently ruining my life, or my career as the country's most celebrated travel writer would implode. I had given the front desk one strict instruction: absolute isolation. No calls, no knocks, no pity. But as the silence of the penthouse settled around me, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The suite was designed for lovers or diplomats, not for a woman trying to outrun her own mind. The velvet drapes were heavy, pooling on the floor like spilled wine, blocking out the city completely. The ceilings were high enough to make me feel small, insignificant, while the antique furniture seemed to judge my stillness. I sat at the mahogany desk, the wood cool under my forearms, staring at the laptop screen. It glowed, a harsh white square in the dim, amber-lit room. The cursor blinked. On, off, on, off. It was a digital heartbeat, taunting me with my own emptiness, keeping time with a pulse I couldn't seem to find in my own veins anymore. I typed a sentence, deleted it, typed it again. It was garbage. The words felt hollow, stripped of the visceral heat that used to define my work. I was supposed to be the writer who made you feel the humidity of the Amazon and the chill of the Alps just by turning a page. Now, I couldn't even describe the temperature of my own coffee. The silence I had demanded was supposed to be a sanctuary, but it was quickly turning into a mirror, reflecting nothing but my own creative paralysis. Then, the sound came. A soft electronic beep, followed by the hydraulic hiss of the door opening. I stiffened, my shoulders climbing toward my ears. I had specifically requested no housekeeping until noon, but the clock on the bedside table read 10 a.m. I spun the chair around, ready to snap, ready to unleash the frustration of the last 3 months on whoever dared to disturb my exile. But the woman who entered moved like a shadow. She pushed the cart inside with a practiced, fluid grace before the door even clicked shut. Silence followed her. She kept her eyes low, focused on the carpet, adhering to the strict, invisible protocol high-end hotels promise. I said no interruptions, I said, my voice sounding rusty in the quiet room. She stopped. She didn't flinch, didn't jump. She just paused, her hand resting on the handle of the cart. When she finally looked up, the air in the room seemed to shift. She wasn't young, not a girl. She was a woman with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. The scattered papers, the half-empty wine glass from the night before, the tension coiling in my neck, in a single, sweeping glance. "I apologize, ma'am," she said. Her voice was low, smooth, carrying a cadence that felt grounded. "The schedule indicated you were out. I can return later." "No," I sighed, the anger draining out of me as quickly as it had come, leaving just the exhaustion. "Just do what you have to do." Quickly, I turned back to the screen, but I wasn't writing anymore. I was listening. I became hyper-aware of her presence, the soft rustle of fresh linens being pulled from the cart, the snap of a sheet being shaken out over the king-sized bed. It was a rhythm, a cadence of domesticity that felt alien in this fortress of solitude. I found myself watching her reflection in the darkened window. She moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. No wasted energy. She stripped the bed, remade it, and replaced the towels with a precision that felt almost surgical. It was irritating. It was distracting. I wanted to be alone with my failure, not forced to witness someone else's competence. Every smooth tuck of the sheets felt like an indictment of my own messy, unraveling mind. I watched her hands, strong, capable hands smooth out a wrinkle on the duvet. There was a care in her touch that the furniture didn't deserve, a deliberate focus that I envied. She moved to the bathroom, and the sound of running water filled the suite. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars exploded behind my eyelids. Why couldn't I focus? Why was the presence of this silent housekeeper louder than the thoughts in my own head? I needed to write about passion, about the ache of missing someone, but all I could feel was the sterile chill of the air conditioning. She emerged a few minutes later, the cart packed, her presence already receding. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a second, I thought she might say something, but she didn't. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and slipped out. The lock clicked. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. But now, it wasn't empty. The room smelled faintly of lavender and industrial soap, a lingering proof that life existed outside of this cage. I stared at the door, listening to the faint rumble of her cart moving down the carpeted hall. 3 days dissolved into a haze of gray light and room service trays. The isolation I had demanded began to fray at the edges, no longer a shield but a trap of my own making. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, waiting to be filled. And the only thing filling it was her. I stopped trying to banish Lana. I stopped glaring at the clock when 10 a.m. approached. Instead, I found myself waiting for the sound of the keycard, the hydraulic sigh of the door, the rhythmic squeak of her cart's wheels. She became the only variable in a static equation. I told myself I was just observing, that it was a writer's habit to study the human condition. But that was a lie. I was studying her. I moved from the desk to the wingback chair in the corner, a vantage point that allowed me to watch her work without being obvious. Or so I thought. She had a routine that was almost hypnotic. She didn't just clean, she reset the room's energy. I watched her hands, strong and devoid of jewelry, as they moved across the surfaces I had cluttered. She didn't rush. There was a deliberate cadence to her movements, a respect for the objects she touched, even my discarded coffee cups. It was intimate, this act of caring for a stranger's mess, and it made my skin prickle with a feeling I couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude. It was closer to exposure. On the 4th day, the distance between us collapsed, if only for a second. I was sitting at the vanity, pretending to organize my notes, while she cleaned the large mirror above the dresser. The smell of glass cleaner, sharp, chemical, clean, cut through the stale air of the suite. I watched her reflection. Her expression was focused, her eyes tracking the path of the cloth. Then, without warning, her gaze shifted. In the mirror, our eyes met. It wasn't the deferential, glazed-over look of a service worker acknowledging a guest. It was direct, unflinching. For a heartbeat, the cloth stopped moving. She saw me. Not the famous author on the dust jacket, not the VIP in the penthouse, but the exhausted, unraveling woman sitting in a silk robe at noon. The air in the room thickened, charged with a sudden, spiking tension that made my breath hitch. I felt exposed in a way that felt dangerous. Then, just as quickly, she blinked, shifting her gaze back to the glass. But the charge lingered, vibrating in the space between us. That look dislodged something. When she left, I didn't go back to the laptop. I couldn't. The digital screen felt too sterile, too safe. I grabbed a stack of legal pads and a heavy fountain pen. I sat on the floor, leaning against the bed frame, and began to write. It wasn't the travelogue about the Amalfi Coast I was contracted for. It was the story I had been running from for 5 years. The words came out ugly and fast, a purge rather than a draft. I wrote about the airport terminal in Berlin, the cold coffee, the way my ex-fiancé had looked at me when she said she couldn't marry a woman who was married to the road. I wrote about the silence of that apartment, the way grief feels less like sadness and more like a physical amputation. The pen scratched against the paper, a frantic rhythm that matched my pulse. I filled page after page, tearing them off and letting them flutter to the carpet, surrounding myself in a sea of yellow paper and blue ink. By late afternoon, I was drained. My hand cramped, stained with ink, and my head throbbed. The suite felt suffocating again, the air too recycled, too still. I needed to move. I needed to feel wind that wasn't generated by a vent. I stood up, stepping over the scattered pages of the manuscript, my open wounds laid out on the floor. I didn't gather them. I didn't hide them. I was too raw to care about order. I grabbed my coat and keycard, desperate for the anonymity of the city streets. I left the room, assuming that in my isolation, the debris of my breakdown would remain exactly where it fell, unseen and untouched. I walked back into the suite expecting chaos. I expected the yellow legal pads to be exactly where I'd abandoned them, a paper graveyard of my own making scattered across the plush carpet. I was ready to step over my own failure and pour another glass of wine. Instead, the floor was immaculate. The carpet had been vacuumed into perfect geometric lines. The bed was turned down early, the duvet folded with military precision. The drapes were drawn against the twilight, sealing the room in a hush. And on the mahogany desk, centered perfectly under the lamp's glow, was a neat, squared stack of my yellow pages. My stomach dropped, then hardened into a knot of cold fury. This wasn't just housekeeping. This was a breach. The one rule I had drilled into the front desk manager's head, absolute privacy, do not touch my work, had been flagrantly ignored. I marched to the desk, my hand already reaching for the phone to call the concierge. I was going to have someone fired. I was going to demand a refund, a new room, a new hotel. My fingers hovered over the receiver, shaking with the adrenaline of violation. How dare she? How dare she touch the wreckage of my life and try to tidy it up like dirty laundry? It felt invasive, like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged my ribs while I slept. I snatched the stack of papers, intending to throw them into the trash, to burn the evidence that anyone else had seen my pathetic scrawl. That's when I saw it. The top page wasn't the beginning of the scene. It was the end. And on the back of the yellow sheet, in blue ink that definitely wasn't mine, was a sentence. I froze. The rage didn't vanish, it suspended, hanging in the air like smoke. I brought the paper closer, squinting in the dim light. The handwriting was slanted, precise, sharp. Not a scribble, a statement. She didn't leave because she stopped loving you. She left because she knew you'd never stop leaving her. The breath left my lungs in a rush. I sat down hard in the desk chair, the leather creaking beneath me. I read the line again and again. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a critique of my grammar or a fan's gushing note. It was a diagnosis. For 3 days, I had been wrestling with that scene, trying to figure out why the character, why I, had been the victim. I had written it as a betrayal. I had painted her as the villain who walked away because she was weak. But this stranger, this silent woman who folded towels and scrubbed mirrors, had read the scattered, disjointed fragments of my pain and seen the truth I was too cowardly to write. She had seen the selfishness beneath the romanticism. She had seen me. The phone sat on the desk, silent. I didn't call management. I didn't call security. I sat there as the light in the room shifted from the gold of late afternoon to the bruising purple of dusk, holding that piece of paper like it was a holy text. The anger had dissolved, replaced by a terrifying, hollow ache in my chest. It was the ache of being known. Who was she? How did she know? The audacity of it was staggering. To read a guest's private papers was a firing offense. To write on them was insanity. And yet, she had done it. She had risked her job to tell me the truth. I traced the loop of the L in leaving. The ink was still dark, pressed firmly into the paper. She hadn't hesitated. I waited. The evening turndown service was scheduled for 7. Usually, I dreaded the knock, the intrusion. Now, I found myself watching the digital clock, counting the minutes. The waiting felt heavy, like the pause before a curtain rises. I needed to see her face. I needed to know if she looked at me with pity or with that same unflinching intensity I had seen in the mirror. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I left only the desk lamp on, a small, golden spotlight on the evidence of her transgression. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo the ticking of the clock. The air felt thick, charged with a static that had nothing to do with the coming storm outside. It was the pressure of expectations cracking. I wasn't the famous writer anymore, protected by my reputation and my solitude. I was just the woman who had been left, and she, this ghost in a uniform, was the only one who knew why. When the soft electronic chime of the doorbell finally came, it didn't sound like service. It sounded like an answer. "Come in." My voice was steadier than my hands. The door opened. Lana stepped inside, the cart remaining in the hall. She carried a small tray with water and the evening chocolates, trivial props for the scene about to unfold. She moved into the room, her gaze immediately finding me where I stood by the desk. She didn't look surprised to see me waiting. She didn't look guilty either. That was the first thing that threw me. If I had been caught reading a VIP's diary, I would have been trembling. Lana just set the tray on the bedside table with that same maddening precision. "Is there anything else you need for the evening, ma'am?" she asked. Her tone was neutral, professional armor fully in place. I didn't answer. I just held up the yellow sheet of paper, the blue ink facing her. The silence stretched, heavy and taut, like a wire pulled to its snapping point. "You didn't just tidy the room," I said. It wasn't a question. Lana turned slowly. She looked at the paper, then up to my face. She stood with her hands clasped loosely in front of her uniform, a picture of composure that made me feel frantic. "The wind from the window had scattered them," she said quietly. "I was putting them back in order. I couldn't help but see the words." "And the note?" I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "Is critiquing the guest's work part of the turndown service now?" It was a lash, a sharp attempt to put her back in her place. But she didn't flinch. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, not fear, but impatience. "It wasn't a critique," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the professional polish and hitting something rawer. "It was the truth." "You don't know the truth," I snapped, the heat rising in my cheeks. "You don't know me. You don't know the character." "I know she's lying," Lana said. The words hung there. Simple. Devastating. "Excuse me?" Lana took a step toward me. It was small, but it shifted the gravity of the room. She wasn't the housekeeper anymore. She was just a woman standing across from another woman, seeing right through the defenses I'd built. "You're writing her like a victim," Lana said, her eyes locking onto mine. "You're writing her like she was blindsided. But in the scene before, she packs her bag 3 times. She checks the flight schedules. She leaves the keys on the counter before the fight even starts." Lana gestured vaguely to the paper. "She didn't leave because she stopped loving you. She left because she knew if she stayed, she'd eventually hate you for making her wait. And she loved you too much to let that happen." I stood frozen. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. She had peeled back the layers of the story, my story, and found the pulse I had been trying to bury. She spoke with such certainty that the anger drained out of me, leaving me exposed. How? I started, but my voice failed. How do you know that? Lana's expression softened, the intensity dialing back just enough to let me breathe. She looked at the floor for a second, then back at me. Because I've been the one who left, she said softly, and I know what it costs. The confession sat between us, intimate and unexpected. The professional boundary wasn't just blurred, it was gone. We were standing in the wreckage of the protocol, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. I couldn't fix it, I admitted, the admission tasting like ash. I've been staring at that scene for 3 days. You were trying to protect yourself, Lana observed. She reached out, her hand hovering near the desk, then withdrew it. You can't write it if you're still trying to win the argument. She checked the room one last time, her eyes scanning the space. But the gesture felt automatic now. She moved toward the door. Wait, I said. She paused, hand on the latch. Thank you, I whispered. She nodded, a small, private acknowledgement. Good night, Alara. She used my name, not ma'am. Alara. The door clicked shut. The room was quiet again, but the sterility was gone. The air felt charged, electric, lingering with the scent of her and the weight of what she had said. I looked down at the paper. The sentence on the back didn't look like vandalism anymore. It looked like a lifeline. I traced the blue ink with my thumb, feeling the indentation of her pen. It was the first real thing I had felt in weeks. The door clicked shut, but the silence that followed wasn't the sanctuary I had paid for. It was vacant, hollow. I stared at the yellow legal pad on the desk, the blue ink of her handwriting burning into the page like a brand. I tried to sit back down. I tried to summon the discipline that had carried me through 3 bestsellers and 1,000 magazine columns. I put my fingers on the keyboard, ready to translate her insight into my prose. But the words wouldn't come. The room felt too cold, too perfectly curated. The air conditioning hummed a sterile, white noise lullaby that suddenly felt maddening. I was sitting in a glass box, trying to write about fire, and I couldn't feel the heat. I needed the source. I didn't think. If I had thought about it, I would have stayed in the chair. I would have respected the boundaries of class and protocol that kept guests on the top floors and staff in the basement. But the writer in me, the part of me that was starving for something real, was already moving. I grabbed the stack of papers, my hand gripping them tight enough to crinkle the edges, and walked out of the suite. The hallway was quiet, the carpet swallowing the sound of my footsteps. I bypassed the main elevators, the ones with the gilded mirrors and the soft chime. I went to the service elevator at the end of the hall. It was a scuffed steel box that smelled of bleach and old coffee. When I pressed the button for the sub-basement, the descent felt less like a ride and more like a decompression. My ears popped. The air grew heavier, denser, shedding the artificial chill of the upper floors. When the doors slid open, the sensory shift was violent. I was hit by a wave of humidity, damp, cloying, and smelling aggressively of industrial detergent and wet cotton. The roar was immediate. It wasn't a hum. It was a mechanical thrum that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes. This was the gut of the hotel, the organ that kept the luxury alive. Massive silver machines churned and tumbled, rows of them stretching back into the dim, fluorescent-lit cavern. Steam hissed from overhead pipes, curling in the air like fog, softening the harsh angles of the concrete walls. I walked in, feeling instantly out of place in my silk blouse and tailored trousers. The floor was concrete, slick in patches. Carts overflowed with mountains of white linens, towels, sheets, robes, waiting to be purged. It was chaotic and loud, a stark, sweating contrast to the silent tomb of my penthouse. And it felt alive. I found her at the far end of the room, standing before a massive flat iron press. She had her back to me. The crisp, buttoned-up uniform jacket was gone, replaced by a simple gray t-shirt that clung to her shoulder blades. Her hair was pulled back, but strands had escaped, sticking to the damp skin of her neck. She was feeding a king-size sheet into the rollers of the machine. The movement was rhythmic, almost a dance. Snap, pull, feed. Snap, pull, feed. She moved with a physical competence that was mesmerizing to watch. Here, amidst the noise and the steam, she wasn't the invisible ghost haunting my hallway. She was the engine. I watched her for a long moment, the heat of the room seeping into my own skin, making me flush. I felt like a voyeur, but I couldn't look away. There was a power in her focus, a capability that made my own intellectual struggles feel flimsy and abstract. I stepped closer, navigating around a canvas bin filled with soapy water. The noise of the dryers masked my approach until I was almost right behind her. "Lana," I said. The sound of my voice was swallowed by the machines. I stepped into her space, the heat radiating off the iron press hitting my face. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the table she was working on. "Lana." She spun around, her body tense, ready to defend the space. When she saw me, the surprise was unguarded. Her eyes went wide, scanning my face, then down to the papers in my hand, then back up. A flush that had nothing to do with the steam rose on her neck. "Ilara," she said, her voice raising to cut through the din. "You shouldn't be down here. It's not safe for guests. The insurance." "I don't care about the insurance," I interrupted, stepping closer so I didn't have to shout. The proximity was sudden and forced by the noise. I could smell her now. Not just the soap, but the scent of warm skin and hard work. It was intoxicatingly human. "I can't write it." She wiped her hands on a rag tucked into her waistband, her gaze wary. "You can't write what?" "The truth," I said, holding up the yellow pad. I tried. I sat there for an hour, staring at the screen. But the room, it's a lie. I need to know what you know. I need to know why she leaves. Lana looked at me. Really looked at me. The steam hissed loudly from a vent above us, enclosing us in a momentary cloud of white. The gap between us was less than 2 feet. "You came all the way down to the laundry room to ask me about plot motivation?" she asked, a skeptical brow arching. "I came down here because you're the only person who's been honest with me in 5 years, I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could check them. "I'm stuck, Lana. I'm drowning in that suite. Help me." Lana didn't stop working. That was the first thing I noticed, the way she maintained the rhythm of the room, even as she acknowledged my desperation. She didn't treat my creative crisis as an emergency that superseded her labor. She simply integrated me into the workflow. She nodded toward the flat iron press, the massive roller humming with a low, dangerous heat. "If you want to talk," she said, her voice pitched low to slide under the mechanical roar, "you have to make yourself useful. I have 40 king sheets to finish before the night crew comes on." She didn't wait for my agreement. She grabbed a corner of a damp, heavy sheet from the bin and snapped it. The sound was sharp, like a whip crack, cutting through the steam. She held the other corner out to me, an invitation and a challenge, wrapped in white cotton. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. My hands were insured for a ridiculous amount of money, my fingers used to keyboards and wine stems, not industrial labor. But the look in her eyes dared me to retreat. I stepped forward. I took the corner. The cotton was warm and wet, heavy in my hands. "Pull," she instructed. We pulled. The sheet pulled taut between us, a white expanse of tension. For a moment, we were connected by the fabric, anchored to each other, amidst the chaos of the basement. "Read it to me," she said, feeding the edge into the roller. "The part you're stuck on." I fumbled with the yellow pad on the metal table with one hand while keeping tension on the sheet with the other. I began to read, shouting slightly to be heard over the hiss of the steam. I read the dialogue I had agonized over, the polite, restrained goodbye I had written for the protagonist. "Stop," Lana said. She didn't look up from the machine. Her hands were moving dangerously close to the hot rollers, smoothing out wrinkles with a terrifying grace. "She sounds like a press release. She sounds managed." "She's trying to be dignified," I argued, grabbing the next sheet she tossed my way. "She's trying to be you," Lana corrected, her eyes finally snapping up to meet mine. The steam curled around her face, softening the harsh fluorescent light, making her look almost ethereal in the grime. "You're writing the version of the breakup you wish you had. The one where you looked cool and collected. But that's not what happened, is it?" The question hung in the humid air, heavier than the damp linens. We fell into a rhythm. Snap, pull, feed. My body began to mimic hers, learning the cadence of the work. The temperature in the room was oppressive, sticking my silk blouse to my back, making my hair frizzy. But it felt grounding. It eroded the artifice. "No," I admitted, the truth dragged out of me by the repetitive motion. It wasn't dignified. I begged. I sat on the floor of the terminal and I begged her not to get on the plane. Lana stopped the machine. The sudden silence of the roller was deafening. She walked around the side of the press, closing the distance between us. She reached out, not to take the sheet, but to adjust my grip on it. Her fingers brushed mine, rough, warm, calloused against my soft, manicured skin. The contact was electric. It wasn't a spark, it was a circuit closing. The air in the laundry room seemed to contract, pulling tight around us. I could smell the detergent on her skin, sharp and clean, mixed with the salt of sweat. She was so close, I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the stray hair sticking to her temple. "Write that," she whispered, her voice rough. "Write the begging. Write the humiliation. That's the only part that matters, because that's the only part that's true." "I can't," I breathed. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the work. "If I write that, everyone will know." "Let them know," Lana said. Her hand lingered on mine, her thumb tracing the line of my knuckle. It was a small, intimate anchor in the storm of the room. "You're suffocating in that tower, Ilara. You're trying to curate a life that's already messy. Down here, the stains come out, but you have to apply the heat first." She was right. The realization washed over me, hot and undeniable. I had been protecting an image, not a story. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who spent her days erasing the evidence of other people's lives. And I felt a pull so strong, it frightened me. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a hunger to be known, to be stripped down to the raw essentials, just like these sheets. I leaned in, drawn by the gravity of her presence. I didn't know what I was going to do, touch her face, lean into her space, maybe just breathe the same air. But the moment was shattered before it could form. "Lana, we're behind schedule on the 3rd floor." The voice boomed from the hallway, harsh and authoritative. A supervisor. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers. The connection snapped, leaving a physical ache in its wake. Lana retreated instantly into her work, her face closing off, her expression hardening. But before she turned away, she looked at me one last time, her eyes burning with a silent, lingering heat that the steam couldn't obscure. "Go," she mouthed. "Write the truth." I left the envelope with the concierge at 10 o'clock. It contained a keycard to the penthouse and a note that consisted of a single word. "Please." It was a gamble. It was a breach of every unspoken rule that kept the ecosystem of the hotel running, the separation of the served and the server. But I was done with rules. I was done with the pristine, suffocating silence of my own making. I paced the living area of the suite, the carpet wearing thin under my anxiety, watching the city lights flicker below, like a nervous system. I had opened a bottle of wine, poured 2 glasses, and then poured one back, terrified of presuming too much. When the knock came at midnight, it was soft, hesitant. I opened the door, and the air left my lungs. Lana wasn't wearing the uniform. The starch and the structure were gone. She stood there in worn denim jeans and a dark, oversized sweater that swallowed her hands. Without the armor of the hotel's livery, she looked younger, softer, and terrifyingly real. The hierarchy that usually stood between us, the invisible wall of ma'am and staff, dissolved instantly. She wasn't the housekeeper anymore. She was just Lana. And I was just the woman who had begged her for help in a laundry room. "I wasn't sure you'd come," I said, stepping back to let her in. "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted. Her voice was different too, lighter, lacking the professional cadence she used during the day. She walked into the room, not with the efficient bustle of cleaning, but with a slow, curious gravity. She looked at the wine glass, then at the manuscript scattered on the coffee table. "But you left the story bleeding. I couldn't leave it like that." We didn't sit at the mahogany desk. That felt too much like an office, too rigid. Instead, we sat on the floor, the Persian rug rough under our palms, the pages of my life spread out between us like a battlefield map. I poured the wine this time, and she took it. The next 4 hours were a blur of excavation. Lana didn't just read, she interrogated. She sat cross-legged, leaning over the text, her dark hair falling forward to curtain her face. She would tap a paragraph with a fingernail, no longer fearful of leaving a mark, and look at me with those unflinching eyes. "You're protecting yourself here," she said, pointing to a scene in the second act. "You write that you walked away calmly, but you told me downstairs that you begged. Why is the begging not on the page?" "Because it's pathetic," I whispered, the shame of it heating my neck. "It's human," she corrected. She shifted, her knee brushing mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with literature. The reader doesn't need you to be strong, Alara. They need you to be honest. Write the desperation. Write the way your voice cracked. So I did. With her sitting inches away, her presence a steady, anchoring weight, I tore the scene apart. I wrote the ugly truths I had been hiding from the world and myself. I wrote until my hand cramped and the wine was gone. The intellectual intimacy of it was staggering. To let someone see the raw, unpolished drafts of your heart is a kind of nudity more terrifying than shedding clothes. And she didn't look away. She didn't judge. She held the space, guiding me deeper into the wound. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the night wore on. The air grew heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just the work anymore. It was the way she chewed her lip when she was thinking. It was the way her eyes tracked my hands as I typed. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a gravitational pull that was becoming impossible to ignore. Around 4 a.m., the words ran out. We sat in the comfortable silence of exhaustion, the laptop screen dark, the room lit only by the city glow filtering through the shears. I looked at her. She was looking at the view, her profile sharp against the window. "You saved this," I said softly. She turned, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then lifting to my eyes. The movement was slow, deliberate. The tension coiled tight in the space between us. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wet thud. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to trace the line of her jaw, to see if her skin felt as warm as it looked. I leaned in, just an inch, testing the magnetic field. Her breath hitched. Her eyes widened slightly, dark and dilated. We were on the precipice of something that couldn't be undone. Then, the light changed. A gray, watery dawn began to bleed through the curtains, stealing the intimacy of the night. The spell fractured. Lena blinked, pulling back, the reality of the morning rushing in to fill the space where the magic had been. She looked at the window, then at the door, the weight of the coming day settling back onto her shoulders. The moment was gone, but the scorch mark it left on the air remained. The spell didn't break gently. It was shattered by the shrill electronic trill of the landline. I jolted awake on the sofa, my neck stiff, the blanket we had pulled down from the bed tangling around my legs. The room was flooded with the harsh, unforgiving light of mid-morning. The wine bottle on the table was empty. The glasses were stained with dried crimson rings, and the space across from me, the space where Lana had sat, where her knees had brushed mine, where her voice had cracked my chest open, was empty. She was gone. Of course she was gone. The morning shift started at 7. The phone rang again, demanding and incessant. I scrambled to grab it, my heart racing with a sudden, irrational panic. Hello? My voice was a croak. Ilara? Thank God. I've been trying your cell for an hour. It was my publisher. Her voice was sharp, clipped, vibrating with the frantic energy of New York business hours. We need the pages, Ilara. The marketing team is breathing down my neck. Tell me you have something usable. The reality of the world, contracts, deadlines, reputations, crashed into the room like a tidal wave. I looked at the coffee table, at the messy stacks of yellow paper covered in my scrawl and Lana's edits. In the cold light of day, the scene didn't look like a breakthrough. It looked like a breakdown. I have a draft, I stammered, rubbing my temple. It's different. It's raw. Raw is good, she snapped. Raw sells. Just send it. Today. By noon. The line went dead. I sat there, holding the receiver, the quiet settling around me again. But it wasn't the companionable peace of the night before. It was judgmental. I looked around the room, seeing it through the eyes of the morning. The intimacy we had shared felt sudden, reckless. I had let a stranger, an employee, into the deepest, ugliest parts of my psyche. I had let her see the wounds I hadn't even shown my therapist. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in my throat. What had I done? I was Ilara Vance. I was the untouchable observer. I didn't sit on hotel floors drinking wine with the staff and crying over ex-lovers. The vulnerability hangover hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt exposed, raw. I stood up and immediately began to clean. I grabbed the wine glasses, the bottle, the scattered papers. I needed to erase the evidence. I needed to reset the room to its sterile, professional state. I was frantic, shoving papers into my bag, wiping the wine ring off the table with my sleeve. I was rebuilding the walls. I marched to the door and flipped the heavy plastic sign on the handle. Do not disturb. I locked the deadbolt, then the security latch. I sat at the desk, opening the laptop, determined to transcribe the notes, to turn the night's emotion into a product I could sell. I typed 3 sentences. Then I deleted them. Then came the sound I had been dreading, the soft whir of the cart, the pause outside the door. My breath hitched. I stared at the heavy oak paneling, my hands hovering over the keyboard. I knew it was her. I could picture her standing there, hand raised to knock, her face open and expectant, waiting to pick up the thread of connection we had spun in the dark. She knocked. 3 soft, tentative raps. Ilara? Her voice was muffled, low. I brought you coffee. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The shame was a hot weight in my stomach. If I opened that door, I would have to acknowledge that the connection was real. And if it was real, it could hurt me. It was safer to be the difficult guest. It was safer to be alone. I sat frozen, silent as a stone, watching the door handle. I saw it turn slightly, testing the lock, then stop. Silence stretched out in the hallway. She was waiting. She knew I was in there. She knew I was awake. The rejection was absolute. "Okay," she said softly. The word was heavy with resignation. I listened to her footsteps retreat, the soft squeak of her shoes on the carpet fading away. The sound of her leaving was agonizing, a physical ache that radiated from my chest to my fingertips. I had protected my privacy, just like I wanted. I had secured my solitude, and I hated it. I tried to write. I forced myself to look at the screen, to summon the professional detachment that had made me famous. But the words were ash. Without Lana's gaze, without the pressure of her truth in the room, the story felt flat. I wasn't writing. I was typing. The magic hadn't come from the wine or the late hour. It had come from her. I pushed the laptop away, burying my face in my hands. The room felt massive, cavernous. I realized then that the block hadn't been about the plot. It hadn't been about the ex who left. It was about this terrified refusal to let anyone in, this instinct to lock the door the moment things got real. I hadn't been writing because I hadn't been feeling. I had been hiding. Outside, the sky bruised purple. The light in the room dropped as heavy clouds rolled over the city skyline, blotting out the sun. The first drops of rain hit the window pane like bullets, hard and fast. A storm was breaking, violent and sudden, mirroring the chaos that was finally, mercifully, tearing down my walls. I ripped the door open. The Do Not Disturb sign fluttered to the carpet, a cheap plastic lie I was done telling. The hallway was empty, the cart gone. The silence I had demanded was now a physical weight I had to push through. I didn't walk. I ran. I bypassed the elevators, taking the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the burn in my thighs. I checked the linen closet on the 4th floor. Empty. I burst into the basement laundry room, hoping for the heat, the noise, the anchor. But the machines were silent. The lights dimmed. The press where we had stood, where the air had crackled between us, was cold. Where? Where does the ghost go when she's not haunting the halls? Then I remembered. The view. She had looked at the window in my suite with a hunger that had nothing to do with the glass. I sprinted back up the stairs, lungs burning, past the penthouse, all the way to the heavy steel door marked roof access. I didn't care about the rules. I slammed the crash bar with my hip and stumbled out into the gale. The wind hit me like a physical blow, whipping my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the city skyline into a watercolor smear of charcoal and neon. And there she was. Lana stood near the parapet, her back to me, facing the storm head on. She wasn't wearing a coat. Her uniform was soaked, clinging to her frame. She looked immovable, a statue carved out of the storm itself. "Lana!" I screamed, the wind tearing the name from my lips. She turned slowly, hair plastered to her skull. Her eyes were dark, unreadable in the gloom. She didn't move toward me. She stayed on her side of the roof, behind the invisible line I had drawn between us that morning. "You should go back inside, Alara," she shouted over the roar of the rain. Her voice was flat, resigned. "You'll catch a cold. You have a deadline." To hell with the deadline! I crossed the wet gravel roof, my shoes slipping on the slick surface. I didn't care. I needed to be close enough to see the flecks of gold in her eyes again. I didn't answer the door because I was scared, not because I was busy. Lana watched me approach, her guard up, her posture defensive. Scared of what? A cup of coffee? Scared of this, I gasped, stepping into her space. The rain was freezing, but the heat radiating off her was palpable. I'm not stuck on the book, Lana. I'm stuck on me. I've been writing about leaving because it's the only way I know how to survive. But I don't want to leave this time. The admission hung between us. Lana's expression cracked. The professional mask dissolved, washed away by the rain, leaving only raw, naked hope. Then don't, she whispered. The tension finally snapped. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. I reached out, grabbing the lapels of her soaked uniform, and pulled her to me. When our mouths met, it wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It was desperate, wet, and cold, tasting of rain and salt, the terrifying relief of finally crashing into something solid. Lana made a low sound in her throat, her hands coming up to grip my waist, pulling me flush against her. The world fell away. The deadline, the reputation, it all dissolved. There was only the heat of her mouth, the strength of her hands, the undeniable reality of her body against mine. It was a reclamation. I wasn't the observer anymore. I was in the storm, and for the first time, I wasn't looking for shelter. We broke apart, gasping, foreheads resting against each other, the rain running in rivulets down our faces. I was shivering, my silk blouse ruined, my hair a disaster. But I had never felt more grounded. We're going to freeze, Lana murmured, her thumb brushing a wet strand of hair from my cheek. My room, I said, the offer clear. No more locks. She nodded, her hand finding mine. We turned toward the door, leaving the storm behind, but carrying the electric charge of it with us. The storm passed, leaving a gray, gentle morning. I watched Lana, wrapped in my robe, looking out at the skyline. The uniform was gone. So was my fear. I sat at the desk and finally typed the ending. Not the one I planned, but the one I lived. I wasn't leaving this hotel today. Not yet. The manuscript sits finished, but my eyes are on her. If you believe in unexpected love, please subscribe right now.